Hello, hi, welcome to this virtual blackout briefing. So today we'll be talking about new methods for hypervisor detection. Just a few words about me. I work in academia. I'm a postdoc in Sapienza University in Italy. I work in software and system security. And I'm returning to Black Hat this year. Last year I was presenting a system, Blue Pill, for handling evasive malware. But this year I'm working for the other side. We will be presenting new red pills. In particular, we will be dealing with sandboxes that are able to hide discrepancies of virtualization by faking the results of time measurements made by a program. So we will be building our own covert time source, and we will be retrofitting existing detections based on time for hypervisors, and we will see if now these retrofitted primitives can detect sandboxes. And then the other attack that I'm going to present is a prime and probe attack on the last level cache to detect again the presence of a virtual machine monitor. Let's get started. I want to talk briefly about the importance of hypervisors and why cannot be avoided in malware analysis today. Well, hypervisors are important for scalability of the analysis because you can run many virtual machines and do your analysis on servers, but also from a transparency point of view. So in recent years, many researchers and companies, they've proposed designs where the agent functionality of a sandbox is implemented at a hypervisor level using virtual machine introspection, so to reduce the number of artifacts that you have in the execution and then that an adversary can look for. So hypervisors are really important, and the problem with hypervisors is that they introduce some discrepancies. To understand these discrepancies, let's talk a little bit of how virtualization works under the hood. So the CPU offers assistance to hypervisors for virtualization. There is the VMX operation of the CPU. So there is a VMX root mode. It's the high privilege mode. That is where your virtual machine monitor resides and operates. So this VMM is your host, is giving your resources, assigning virtual processors to guest, etc. And then you have a non-root mode where your guest is running. This is your virtual machine. And there is a virtual machine control structure that regulates the transitions between root and non-root mode. So this is important because there are some operations in the guest, that operations or events that require VMX root mode. So what happens is that there is a VM exit event, the VMM takes over, and once the monitor has finished, there will be a VM entry event back into the guest. Virtualization, hardware-assisted virtualization has been conceived for high performance and compatibility. There is a seminal work from Garfinkel from 13 years ago where he was claiming that in the presence of a dedicated adversary, it's almost impossible to build a fully transparent virtual machine monitor. So there are some discrepancies, and even though many enhancements have been made by CPU producers, think of extended page tables or other mechanisms, there are still some problems in terms of transparency, and for instance, the transitions to the virtual machine monitor are inevitable. Let's start with an example, the CPU ID instruction. So CPU ID reveals you properties of the processor, and this will cause a VM exit. So the moment that you execute CPU ID in the guest, the VMM takes over and also has the possibility of changing the properties that you're exposing for the CPU to the guest. So you might be changing the brand string or other aspects, but there is also a so-called hypervisor bit that is 1 when you're running in a hypervisor, that in a sandbox you should be turning into 0. But the point here is not about the data returned by CPU ID. The point is about how long it takes for CPU ID to run. So if we time the execution of CPU ID, for instance, on the laptop that I'm using for recording this presentation, we will see that if I run this sequence on the native host on the operating system, I will be measuring around 300 cycles, while if I do it under VirtualBox, I will be getting 10 times more, because here I'm including the latency of performing a VM entry and VM exit. So what can I do as a sandbox architect? Well, yeah, I should be tracking those instructions like CPU ID or other patterns that might be abused to cause VM exit, but that covers me only for the detection part. For countering those attempts, I need to control the time sources. I need to alter the perception of time inside the guest. And it's not enough to just hook the APIs and change the results. What you need to do is you need to intercept the execution on the RDTSC instruction. You have to configure the virtual machine monitor to have a VM exit also for RDTSC, and you can keep track of the time that you spend in the VMM, and you can subtract this time from the values that RDTSC is returning during the execution. This problem is not new in other areas either. So, for instance, in the microarchitectural attacks literature, there was this seminal work, The Spy in the Sandbox, where they were able to perform an Llc attack from a browser using JavaScript and the performance now primitive of JavaScript. So to shut the door to those attacks, vendors said, okay, let's just make this clock much worse. We reduce the resolution. But researchers, they came up with 2 countermeasures. One was recovering resolution even from a crippled clock, and the other, which I will be using in this work, is to build your own time source. What do I mean by that? Timestamp counter is essentially a variable that you can only read with dedicated instructions. But you may say, okay, I want to build my own variable. I can dedicate a CPU core just to increment this variable, and I will read it from my main thread. And whenever I need to time the execution of CPU ID, I will be reading this variable twice. This variable, how often it gets incremented? It is fast enough, the resolution is good, and are those measurements reliable? So let's do some tests. This is some code for computing the approximate resolution of our time sources. So we will be comparing the timestamp counter and with RDTSC and our counter clock. So with the timestamp counter, the nice thing is that in recent Intel CPUs, the clock ticks at a nominal frequency. So it doesn't depend on the current frequency of the CPU. Let's make some measurements. And with this code, we obtain for RDTSC some values that are very, very close to the nominal frequency for the CPU. But for the counter thread, we get a much lower resolution. It's not too bad, it's like 5-6 times worse, but it might not be enough for some attacks. It's good for CPU ID, but not for others. So can we do better? Can we increment that variable faster? And some researchers in Graz University, they came up with a clever idea. They say the problem of that increment is that to update the counter, you first have to read the current value, and then you can update it. And you're reading and writing from memory. So this means 2 accesses to the L1 cache. You can save one of those accesses by keeping the counter in a register. So you increment a register and then you copy the register contents to memory. This works very well because the increment has like super low latency and the move is not that bad. And actually, you'll be surprised, but you can get an enhanced counter thread that can tick faster than the original timestamp counter thanks to instruction level parallelism and other magic that happens at the microarchitectural level. So the resolution problem seems kind of solved. Let's see about reliability. So we need a CPU core for running this counter thread. We cannot run the counter thread alongside our detection on the same thread, on the same core. So what can we do? We don't want to trust what the operating system says. I have 8 cores, 4 cores, or 3 cores. This number can be faked. We need to be sure that we're not dealing with a single core machine. So there is a detection method proposed in this paper, which is to check from one thread if another thread is running and the other way around. So we can use antiquary system information, access some internal structures of Windows, and check the thread state from there. This works, but a Sandbox architect that knows this trick can fake those results. So let's do it without APIs. So what we do is we still raise 2 threads, and the idea is that every thread has its own counter, and we see from the other thread if this thread is incrementing this counter. So we make an observation and then we make another, and we check if in the meantime the thread has increased the counter. So this mechanism is this is more complicated to intercept and fake for a sandbox. We have detection methods to determine whether we have enough cores to run our counter threads. There's still a problem though, that is the workload of the machine. Even if you have 2 cores, there is still a possibility that you might be descheduled. So your clock stops ticking and you get a stale value and you cannot make measurements. You can say, okay, I'm just set a very high priority for the thread, but this doesn't solve the problem. Can improve the situation, but it's not a solution. It's also conspicuous. What you can do is you can poke the counter. You can check for a heartbeat. You can read the counter, read it again, and see if the value has changed. If it has changed, the thread is beating, so it's ticking. And you can take that last measurement, and that will be your starting time. Otherwise, you keep waiting. And then it's important in general with counter threads, but also with the RDTSC, that you serialize your measurements using fences. So now we have time primitive. We want to put it into action. So we studied popular time-based detection for hypervisors, and we implemented them both with RDTSC, and then we plugged the counter thread version in our counter thread primitives, and then we compared the results. So I will be presenting 4 detections. One I already kind of presented it already, the latency of CPU ID instruction. If you fail this test, it's not a good sign in a sandbox. But the idea is that in this test, you normally you can make different observations, take the average value, and compare it against some bare metal threshold, say 100,000 as TSC difference. Then there is another test, which is a different flavor and appeared in the Llc malware the first time. So the Llc authors had this clever idea of comparing the execution time of get process heap and close handle. Normally get process heap is like super fast, it's just three instructions, and close handle takes longer. However, if you execute this code without hardware assistance for your virtual machine, you will get a high execution time for get process heap because you're accessing through the segment register, you're accessing the process entry block, the thread entry block for this operation. But also, I mean, you will not be detecting VirtualBox with this method, but you might be detecting a custom hypervisor that is intercepting accesses to the process entry block and the thread entry block. So this detection will actually give us surprising results. But first, there are two more detections to present that they were described in again the DINVA paper that I referenced before. So we reproduced the research. And the first detection is to, instead of checking the absolute execution time for CPU ID, we make a comparison. We run CPU ID in a loop, and then we run another instruction in a loop. We make different measurements, and we compare the execution time ratio. Because I mean, the absolute times can change between different architectures and can be forged, but the ratio is more reliable. And you can compare CPU ID to some low latency instruction. We use NOP, just like the others. The other detection is clever. Actually, this time we are not looking for a latency because of the VM monitor has to execute this time. We look for a latency that is induced by some thrashing, some pollution on the microarchitectural state from the VMM execution. So in this attack, we search for TLB entries, the transitional leukocyte buffer entries that are addicted by the VMM. So we fill the TLB, then we execute CPU ID or cause a VM exit in other ways, and then we analyze the latencies in accessing some attacker control pages. And yeah, the advantage is that you cannot fool this by just subtracting time, because we are not measuring CPU ID here. We're measuring the effects. The only downside of this strategy is that filling the TLB, there is no unique strategy, but there is the linear filling algorithm that works quite well, which says that you guess first the TLB sites, then you allocate that many pages to fill it. You load them, you take care of caches to cancel their effects with flushing, and you measure the maximum access time that you observe for all the pages. So you make some comparison with CPU ID, and then you get the baseline with, for instance, you run NOP in a loop. And let's see the results. Right, so yeah, I mean, we obtained results on several machines that we controlled, but the interesting part is when we submitted this to malware analysis services, to Sandboxes. So we resorted to public services and some subscriptions that we had. And also a nice thing is that many people downloaded it from the feeds when we were submitting those from public services. We obtained around 76 results, like 76 machines completed most of our tests. Let's see in detail. First of all, let's see how did it go with the counter-thread resolution. So we observed that for nearly half of the machine, we had a timestamp counter that was slower than the counter thread, which was good. But in the other half, we didn't get a faster clock, but was still a pretty good clock. So we're sticking within 40% of the frequency. This means that there is some work to do in finding other primitives for incrementing that variable faster when using other microarchitectures. But the interesting part is that we observed in some cases that TSC frequency that we measured with our method was significantly different than what you would expect for the CPU model that was exposed by the sandbox. So meaning that probably that model was fake. For CPU ID, well, we observed that only 23 machines passed this test. Sorry, 23. So we obtained this number by double checking the latencies also with the results that we obtain with detection tree, since the average is not really a good method, but so it's done in the wild. And what about these 23 machines? I mean, the other machines, that one that failed the test, we observed that also with the counter thread we obtain high values. But for those that passed the test, we saw that 14 were single core, and so they are trivially detected. For 6, we were observing fake timestamp counter values because the counter threads were high, the counter thread measurements were high, and we're revealing the actual latency of CPU ID. We found one case where it was running in QEMU, where the counter thread was going super slow. And we found also that in one case, it was too close to call, and in another case, the sandbox timed out too fast before we could get also the counter thread measurements. So this test is not really reassuring for for defender's perspective, because only 23 passed this test. And we also saw that the Llc test gave surprising results. Again, 23 machines, not the same 23, but 23 were running in an emulator or they were trapping on those memory accesses. And 13 of them tested to be single core, according to our tests. So this gave us surprising results, because this, we were expecting fewer. But let's talk about detection 3, which revealed 2 more machines than detection 1. By looking at those results, actually we saw that 2 were failing the Llc test, 7 had fake timestamp counter values, so we were able to detect them with the counter thread, but for 12 of them there was just too much noise, so for the NOP cycle. So we will try in the future to run these experiments again using another instruction. And we observe something very interesting for the fourth detection, which is the most effective when it runs. Was completed by fewer machines because it takes long to execute. And while for several machines the latencies were unstable, so probably the TLB filling didn't succeed, we observed that out of 29 machines, 24 were detected, and there were no discrepancies for the counter threads, because there was no point for sandboxes in faking the timestamp counter in those cases, unless they knew and they detected this attack. So at the end of the day, we obtained that we were able to detect many sandboxes either as a single core machine, or we could tell that their timestamp counters were being forged. So counter threads helped a lot in this regard. But it's time to present the second contribution of this talk. It's a new detection, and it's based on an LLC prime and probe attack. So the idea is to look for effects just like the TLB eviction, but on caches, which can be quite reliable to measure, especially on the LLC. And we will be looking for last level cache lines that were evicted by the execution of the virtual machine monitor. The LLC, they're widely used in microarchitectural research for attacks, for high resolution attacks. And we will mount a prime and probe attack. But first of all, let me tell you just a little bit of how Llc addressing works. So the idea is that they are addressed by physical addresses. So if you have some data at this virtual address X in a program, you need first to transform it into a physical address, right? You have the MMU for that. And from the bits of this physical address, you will be able to determine in which cache set and in which slice of the cache you should be putting this cache line when you're reading or writing it. And the number of sets, I mean, it depends on the size of the cache, but also on the associativity of the cache, the number of ways, which is also the sides of the set. So we will be mounting a prime and probe attack. The idea is that we will fill cache set entry. Sorry, we will fill each cache set entry and with attacker control data. Then we will cause a transition to the VMM, and we will try to see if this transition evicted, polluted one or more lines that we were controlling. Those lines, they will see a higher latency when we try to access them because they will cause an LLC miss. But how do you find eviction sets for LLC? So eviction sets, if you don't know them, they are some sets that contain virtual addresses that they map to the same cache set. So the optimal size is given by the associativity of the cache. So for a 16-way associative, you need 16 addresses to fill that set, and you need also to build for this attack a minimal eviction set, an optimal one for all the available callers. So the caller is determined by some bits of the physical address that normally you don't control unless you're native hardware with huge pages. But those bits are part of the set index that will tell you in which cache set you're ending up for this cache line. And the slice is determined also by the cache tag. But the point is that inside the VM, you have a further level of indirection. So even if you know the correspondence between the virtual addresses and the physical addresses that are available to the guest, to the operating system in the guest, there is this extra level of indirection because guest physical addresses, they need to be translated to host physical addresses, and those HPAs are the addresses that you use for indexing your cache. And in a sandbox, you can make no assumptions on the mapping between virtual addresses and host physical addresses. So you need techniques that can build eviction sets without making assumptions on the mapping between virtual addresses and cache sets. So there is this paper from Oakland last year. They presented a method and released the code which we use to build eviction sets in a time that is linear in the size of the cache. And we, starting from a large buffer, they prune it with some clever group thresholding heuristics, and it works pretty well. So we build eviction sets for all cache callers using this method. Then we do the priming part of the attack. So we preload the entries from the eviction set in the cache set, and then we prime. So we measure the access time. We will see that it is constant for every entry. Then we trigger a transition in the virtual machine monitor, and we measure again the access time for every line in the set. And the moment that the maximum access time becomes high, and we can tell that there was a miss, and this miss was likely caused by the VMM execution. So we implemented this. Actually, the code is OS agnostic. It works on Linux, Windows, Mac OS. You only need library functions to allocate memory, and it works with counter threads too. So it's good even if you have unreliable timestamp counter measurements in a sandbox. You can try counter threads. We tested this code on a whole lot of Intel CPUs. From old to pretty recent ones, like Whiskey Lake architecture. And we tried several versions of VirtualBox, VMware on different host operating systems, and we tried KVM and Xen. I will be presenting some of the results. So on this machine, we were able to try most different combinations. And we saw that this is the Whiskey Lake one. So we saw that, for instance, a VirtualBox on Windows during a CPU ID was polluting about 20 out of the 128 eviction sets that we built. On Linux was just a bit less. On similar numbers we saw on VMware, even though we were not able to build all the desired cache sets, probably for some partitioning we are still investigating. And same for KVM, and this was done. The test took 2 to 3 minutes, while on the native host it took around 1 minute. Also, we kept looking into VirtualBox, and we observed that even on different machines there was a significant increase in the number of sets that are polluted when moving from version 5.2 to VirtualBox 6. And we observed in general that also in other CPU and hypervisor combinations, while on a native execution you don't see evictions, or you might get some 1 or 2 but evicted because the system workload was high. Here we consistently got several sets that were being evicted, and the interesting part is that if you're running on a custom virtual machine monitor that performs, for instance, analysis at the hypervisor level, you might be polluting even more cache sets. The limitations of this technique is that for big caches the execution time might be longer than the timeout of your sandbox, or even worse, the eviction set construction might fail, for instance, if you're dealing with non-inclusive caches like on some Xeon machines. So right now I'm working on extending those results with the techniques that are described in these 2 papers. One is dealing with non-inclusive caches for building eviction sets, and the other improves the method that I've been discussing before to build minimal eviction sets much quicker. So there is still some potential to explore. But to conclude my talk, I think that this intersection between microarchitectural research and malware analysis, malware evasion, could be a promising research area. I think that from the point of view of sandbox architects, they should explore some code analysis to detect at least the possibility that you're dealing with counter threads or microarchitectural attacks like prime and probe patterns. This is easier said than done, but at least for counter threads, for instance, you can think of them as a race condition on a variable between different threads in terms of code analysis. And another thing to do that is pretty low effort for them is to keep track of performance counters for the detection side. For instance, with performance counters, you will be able to detect that the Llc prime and probe attack is going on. While for the offensive part, for new evasion, I think there is a lot of room to explore. You might be using these techniques for looking this time for specific virtual machine monitor features. And there are also several other microarchitectural attack vectors that are worth exploring and can be exposing the virtual machine monitor in other ways. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk. But before I finish, I would like to thank 3 guys, Christian, Pietro, and Federico, that helped me at different stages of this research. And I want to thank you very much for the attention. And yeah, feel free to hit me up with your questions. Thank you very much.